turn with me in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're going to be in verse 16. And we saw last week as the preacher, the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, he went through that poem, that there's a time to be born and a time to die, and all of our life is encompassed within these times, and those times are beyond us. They are beyond our control, but God, who is good and God who is gracious, He is sovereign over all those times. But now, the writer of Ecclesiastes, now the preacher, he is going to deal with some objections that rise. Right, we look around life sometimes and we see things and we see what's going on in the world around us. We experience difficulty. We go through tough times. And those questions naturally pop into our mind. Is God really in control here? Is God really good? Is God really at work? Because the way things seem, sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it doesn't appear that way. And so the writer of Ecclesiastes, he's wanting to address these objections that people have to God being in control. So look with me beginning in verse 16. We're going to read into chapter 4. The preacher writes, "Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. And I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to the dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who were already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and who has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, and yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, and he has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they can keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is a vanity and striving after the wind." The writer of Ecclesiastes, he's a bit of a downer, isn't he? You read Ecclesiastes and it sort of just sucks the life out of you. We all die. Everything's fleeting. Nothing lasts. There's oppression, there's pain, there's sorrow. Have a good day. I mean, it's tough. But we need to see where Ecclesiastes is in the flow of the Bible. Because I like to view Ecclesiastes as the anti-Proverbs. Ecclesiastes is the small print to Proverbs, if you will. If all we had was Proverbs, I think we would be mistaken. Because Proverbs says, blessed is the man who walks in the way of righteousness. And it talks about all these blessings that come to people who live a life of righteousness. It talks about how if you are wise with your finances, you'll have finances. How if you pursue a life of righteousness, good things will happen to you. It talks about how if you have the right values in parenting and in your marriage, things will go well. The problem is life doesn't work like that. Because we try to do the right things and then doesn't always pan out. And we mistakenly see Proverbs as promises, but they're not. They're Proverbs. They're general statements of truth, right? It is saying, if you do this, generally this is what will happen. And then Ecclesiastes comes along, and Ecclesiastes is like the fine print on those commercials. It's like the warning labels on those products. Right? We see those commercials on television and it says, if you buy this, you will be happy and everything in your life will be good. And then you see that small print at the bottom that says, we don't really mean any of it. Proverbs comes along and says, here's the general statement of truth. If you live a life of righteousness, your life will go well. That's generally true. But it's not always true. And so then Ecclesiastes comes along and it says, you know what? You can be righteous and there's still suffering. You can be righteous and there's still pain. You can be righteous and there's still brokenness. You can be righteous and the world around you is going to be failing. Because remember, what the writer of Ecclesiastes is doing is he is looking at life under the sun. He is looking at life apart from a commitment to God. He is looking at life that seems to exclude God. And so he gives us these warnings. He gives us these exemptions, if you will. Right? Some of those warning labels, they crack me up. If you ever read them, some of them are really funny. I read one on one of those outdoor antennas that says, do not install if you are drunk or pregnant or both. It's good basic advice. On a hairdryer, the warning label read, do not use while you are sleeping. On those Duraflame fire logs, if you look, there's a caution that says, warning, flammable. On Easy Cheese bottles, it says, for best results, remove the top. If you remember those iPod shuffles that came out several years ago, they were little. There was a warning label that says, do not eat. Just in case you really love music and you think you want it to be part of you, don't eat your iPod. On a Razor go-kart, it says, this product moves when used. And my favorite, on a pair of Superman pajamas for a child, it says, wearing this garment does not mean that the person will be able to fly. Those warning labels are basically there because there is somebody who goes, now listen, I bought this expecting to be able to fly like Superman. Somewhere along the line, that's what I want to know. I want to know the story of the person who's sitting there with the cap on the Easy Cheese going, why won't this come out? And Ecclesiastes is there to remind us that things don't always work the way we expect and don't always work the way that we want, because we live in a world where most of the people look at life under the sun. Unless we get caught up in this notion that if we're good, everything goes right, and if we obey God, we don't have any difficulties. Ecclesiastes comes along, and you'll notice the preacher here, he uses this phrase several times, I have seen, I looked, and I saw. Right? He's observing what life is like because of people living under the sun. And he's going to talk about these 5 objections that people have to this idea that he introduced in the first 15 verses of chapter 3, that God's in control. He's going to look around and see, okay, so you say God's in control. You say there's a time for everything. You say God appoints the seasons. But look around, look and see what's happening. And so he looks at these 5 things. And the first problem is we see injustice. See what he says there in verse 16? I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. Right? In the place of justice, in the courts, in the government, the place where justice most needs to thrive, the place where justice has to be, he looks and he sees wickedness. He looks in the religious courts. And in Israel, those religious courts, they even had some political capital. And he looks and he sees, and there's wickedness. There is no justice. There is no righteousness. There is just wickedness. And why is there wickedness? Because he says that under the sun, we're just beasts. Now, literally what he says here is that man left to himself, man in and of himself, man alone is a beast. It's important to understand this is not his view. He's not just saying that all human beings are animals. But he is saying under the sun. Right? You remove God from the equation, what are we? We're animals. We're this conglomeration of cells. We're the process of genetic mutation. If you deny the existence of a creator, all we are is just matter, and all we are is dust, and all we are is the product of these impulses in our brain. And when we are just the product of these impulses in our brain, when there is no creator, when there is no God, there can be no justice. Because apart from God, there can be no truth. See, here's the problem. If all we are is dust, if all we are is animals, then the justice we seek is justice for me. If you go to different countries, if you go around the world, if you go into different cultures, they all have their idea of what justice is. They have different things that they say are good and different things they say are bad, because there's no universal standard of morality when we live with that horizontal view, when we live under the sun. Right? Under the sun, those who are in control make everybody else do what they want. And the writer of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, says instead of justice, there's just wickedness. Can you imagine a culture in which people use courts and laws to promote wickedness? Have you ever heard of such a thing? Watch the news. Right? When all we are is animals, when all we are cells and matter and impulses, then there's no justice, because it's all about what I feel is right. It's about what is just for me. It's about what I want to do. And we live in this culture where we see this on a daily basis, where because people view human beings as nothing more than animals, there is no justice. Just this week in California, of course, is where a lot of those videos, those Planned Parenthood videos, have been filmed, where they're selling the organs of aborted fetuses for money. You know, they passed a law in California this week, the Coastal Commission did, that bans the breeding of orcas in captivity because it's cruel. Think about that for a moment. It is cruel to breed orcas in captivity because they cannot be themselves, and yet lives can be extinguished because of the whim of somebody else, and then they are sold for profit. That's what happens when we live under the sun and we're nothing more than animals. That's what happens when there is no God, when there is no idea of people being created in the image of God, when there is no idea of people being made to fellowship with God, when all there is just our beings, when all there is just this air that's in our lungs and these thoughts that are in our head, there is no justice. And the preacher says, all we are is from dust, and we're going to go to the dust. He says all humanity under the sun has the same destination. All humanity under the sun is going to the grave. And if we view each other the same, we're going to be treating each other the same. Right? If I just view people as no different than animals, if I view people as just the process, the product of an evolutionary process, I'm going to treat them like animals. If I don't see them created in the image of a holy God, if I don't see them with His imprint of love in their souls, then I'm going to treat them no different than the world around me, than the animals, than things like that. Right? I read also this week a guy named Sam Simon. He was one of the co-creators of The Simpsons. He died of cancer last year, and he was worth well over $1 billion. And now there's a legal fight going on because he had in his will care for his dog for about $200,000 a year. Because, you know, before you get judgment, his dog needs weekly acupuncture treatments for $4,000. And so there's this fight. And this is the world we live in, where we're viewed as no different than animals. We're just all this dust. But the preacher, he comes in here and he reminds us that humanity is more than just an animal. Humanity is more than just dust. Right? He says, though when you live life under the sun, it seems as though humanity, all life, whether it's animal, whether it's human, it's just from dust to dust. He says, but there is such a thing in humans as a soul. And the beast just goes into the earth, but humans go back to the God in whose image they were created. And he doesn't get into all of this, but it's either for judgment or for acceptance, either to be judged or to be accepted in Christ. You see, only when we believe in God can there be justice. Why is there justice when we believe in God? Because God Himself is just. And the preacher here promises that one day God is going to judge. You see, he said in verse 17, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. Justice is promised one day. We just need to be patient on the timing. Here's the thing. If we look under the sun, all we see is injustice. All we see because of sinful humanity, all we see because of our greed and of our pride and of our arrogance and self-centeredness, we just see this injustice running rampant. But the preacher says one of these days God is going to judge. And we serve a God who is just, and we serve a God who will enact justice. And so instead of living my life consumed with whether or not I'm experiencing injustice, instead of being worried about whether or not I'm going to get what I feel I deserve, as one who lives for God, I can stop worrying about that and I can trust, hey, God's going to make all things right one day. The problem, though, is the timing. Because what we want justice immediately. Right? Somebody cuts us off in traffic, we want them to get a flat tire right then. Somebody has 14 items in the 10 item or less checkout lane, we want them called on it and then charged extra. We want justice, but we want it on our terms. But when I say, I don't have to worry about justice, I don't have to worry about trying to get what I can deserve, I can give that over to God. And I can let God judge the wicked and God judge the righteous, and I can trust His goodness, and I can trust His wisdom, and I can trust His plan, then it frees me up from this burden of trying to make everything right and trying to make everything fit in the way I view things. So we see injustice, But we can rest knowing that one day all things are going to be made right. But then secondly, we experience oppression. If all we do is view people, if all that is done under the sun is people viewing one another as animals, then there's going to be oppression because it's all a big power struggle. Do we not see this on a daily basis? In corporations, there are boards who are fighting for power. In governments, there are people who are fighting for power. Right? You can even think throughout the 20th century. There's been one oppressive leader, an oppressive dictator, and so a group of people come and say, we're going to fight and we're going to overturn him. And what do they do when they get in power? They become the oppressive dictator. Oh, we're going to change everything. We're going to make everything right. But then as soon as they get power, then they begin to oppress. And so the preacher looks and he sees all this oppression in the world. He sees the tears of people who are oppressed. And not only is there oppression, but the problem is there is no comfort. There is no one coming alongside to comfort them. There is no one coming alongside to say, it's going to be okay. And the preacher makes a very difficult assertion. He says, it's better to have never lived than to experience oppression without being comforted. He says it is better to be those who have not yet been born than to be those who see this sin going on. The oppression was so bad, the lack of comfort was so bad, the lack of concern and care for a fellow human being was so lacking. He says it's better to have not been born. If all life is under the sun, if there is no God, if there is no one to whom we are accountable, he's saying it's better to have never been born than to go through what people go through on a regular basis. Right? And under the sun, people live as if it's all about taking care of yourself. I do what makes me happy. I do what makes me fulfilled. I do what satisfies my needs. I do what fulfills me. When people live under the sun, when people ignore the presence of God, when people ignore the fact that they're accountable to God, that's how they live. It is a selfish existence, and selfishness always results in oppression. Because we want people to meet our needs, and we want people to fit in our box of how they should act and how they should think. Right? Oppression doesn't only happen in governments and in corporations. Oppression happens in homes. When a husband will bully his wife into trying to be who he wants her to be and act how he wants her to act. A dad will bully his kids when they're not who he thinks they should be. And because he's living selfishly, because everything is about him, he oppresses people to try and make them fit into this ideal of who he thinks they should be. And when we live under the sun, when it's just about us, when all we are is dust, that's how we will naturally live. Because if this life is all there is, I need to have my time. I need to get my joy in now because this is it. But when we look beyond ourselves, when we realize that God is there, it frees us up. And instead of living as those under the sun who just oppress people, instead of living this selfish existence, we can be selfless, and we must seek to comfort those who are oppressed. And this is one of the reasons I believe God puts the church in a broken world. God puts us here so that as we go, we are looking and we're seeking and we're trying to find who is oppressed, and we comfort them. We help wipe away their tears, and instead of ignoring the oppression, instead of ignoring the pain that goes on around us, instead of keeping our eyes down as we just go through life, we are seeking to comfort those who are oppressed. Those who are oppressed by sin, those who are oppressed by addiction, those who are oppressed by their own decisions, those who are oppressed by poverty. Right? God's people are here, and we're here to seek to comfort them. We're here to seek to help them and to minister to them and to be a blessing to them. If life under the sun is just about a selfish existence, then life above the Son. Life looking at God, that vertical viewpoint, is all about selflessness. It's all about living for Him. It's all about showing His love and His grace. And when we experience oppression, or when we see oppression, we seek to comfort it. But the third thing that the preacher mentions is that people are met with envy and strife and rivalry. He says in verse 4, "Then I saw all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor." You see what he says? Basically, progress happens because of jealousy. Under the sun, what drives people is jealousy. What drives people is envy. And so somebody achieves something, and somebody sees them and is jealous of them. Somebody has something, somebody sees that, is jealous of that, and then they work to have more. And it is this vicious cycle of jealousy and bitterness and envy where people keep trying to top each other because they think the more I do and the more I have, the more significant I must be. And if all we are is dust, if that's our viewpoint, then my only hope of living beyond my lifetime is to make a name for myself. And so everything in my life is going to be geared towards making a name for myself so that I have achievements that people remember. And I see others who have achievements, and I've got to better those, and I've got to have something greater than that. And he says in such a climate, there are two extremes that people do. The first, somebody sees this rat race. Somebody sees what's going on, and they see this envy and this strife and this bitterness. And he says they fold their hands. That is, they just stop working. Their solution is, well, I'm not going to enter into it. I'm not going to do this. And so I'm just not going to do anything. And they sit and they do nothing. And he warns, he says that a life like that, if you just give up, he says that you begin, he literally says you eat your own flesh. That is, all the stuff you store up, any resources you have, you begin to consume them, and then you've got nothing left. So laziness isn't the answer. If we live in a world where everything is determined, everything is about jealousy and envy and strife, he says just exiting it is not a solution. But the other thing that's a problem is joining in. You see, he talks of this man who has 2 handfuls of toil and striving. Right? That is, this person, they just work and they work and they work and they work and they work, and they're trying to make a name for themselves, and they're trying to accumulate stuff, and they're trying to produce achievements, and everything in their life is so that they can have more and more and more and try and hold on to it. They see what others have and they think, I need to have more of that. And I think we in this country, we're so guilty of that. We always have to have more. We always have to have something bigger, something better. I saw a car that came out recently. It's one of those Teslas, and it has a feature on it where in the event of chemical warfare, you press a button and it pressurizes the cabin of the car, and it has a super filter to filter out biological weapons. And it can be yours for about $130,000. Now, here's the thing, and of course, all these studies are coming out. Will it help? Won't it help? But you know, when I heard that, what I thought, people who buy that, you know why they're buying that? To say they have it. That's what it's about. There really aren't studies to show, will this help, won't it? People are buying it to say they have it. And man, we get caught up in that. We've got to have new stuff and nice stuff, and we've got to have more stuff. We cannot just be content. And that's what the preacher is saying. The answer to all of this is, it's not to just be lazy and to give up, and it's not to try and work hard and to keep up. He says that the key is contentment. Better is a handful of quietness. Better is a handful of contentment, of peace, than 2 hands full of toil. See, the key to feeling these feelings of bitter and strife and envy in our own heart is contentment. If I can be content with what God has given me, if I can be content with where He has put me, if I can be content with the stuff I have, if I can be content with what my finances are, if I can be content with that, then guess what I'm not consumed by? Jealousy. If I can be content, then I don't spend all my day going around going, oh, I want to have that. Oh, I need that. Oh, that will make me happy. And instead of folding my hands and being lazy, and instead of working all the time to have more and more and more, He says, work, strive to have what you need, and be content with it. Be settled. Be content with what God gives you. And so we need to be content, because our problem is so often we base our worth on what we have or what we do. I'm worth something because this is the kind of car I drive. I'm worth something because my home is this many square feet. I'm worth something because this is how much I have in the bank. I'm worth something because here's my job title. I'm worth something because here are my accomplishments. And we tie our worth to that, but here's the problem. Somebody's always going to have more. Somebody's always going to have better. Somebody's always going to do better. Somebody's always going to do bigger. And if I tie my worth to the things I do and the things I have, my worth will always be deficient, and I will be consumed by this bitterness and this jealousy and this envy, which will lead to strife. Because I will feel like in order to feel good about myself, I need to do more. But if I can be content with what God has given me, if I can say, here's the lot God's given me, here's the gifts He's given me, if I can be content with that, and I find my worth in the fact that a good God blessed me, then I don't need to be caught up in all that stuff going on around me. So we're met with envy and strife and rivalry. But then that leads to us feeling isolation. See, jealousy leads to isolation, because when I'm jealous of people, when I don't like people, when I'm just consumed with what people have that I wish I had, then I remove myself from being around them. I spend all my time working so I can have more, and I'm not around other people. And that isolation leads to loneliness. It is amazing to me. We live in the most connected society in the history of the world. With the touch of a button, we can talk to people around the world. We can send messages to people around the world in an instant. We can know what's going on anywhere in the world at any given time of the day. We have social media where people have followers and friends and whatever you want to call it, but people are still lonely. Why are they lonely even with all this connectedness? Why are they lonely even with all this media? Why are they lonely even with things like Facebook and Twitter? Because it's all about me. We use these things not to connect with others, but to advertise ourselves. We use them not for the sake of friendship. We use them for us. And we want people to see us, and we want people to know us, and we want people to know what we do, and we want people to pat us on the back. And so we put all that stuff out there in hopes of having connection, but it doesn't come because everybody else who's on social media is wanting the same thing. And so we're lonely. You see, the preacher writes in verse 7 and 8 of a person who has nobody else. No heir, no brother, no family. And because he doesn't have anybody else, his life is directionless and he is lonely. God created us to live in community. God created us to have relationships with other people. And you can have all the friends in the world on Facebook, and that doesn't mean you live in community. You can have tons of followers on Twitter. That doesn't mean you live in community. Community is when people go through pain together. Community is when people build each other up and pull each other out of difficulty. Community is built when disaster happens and somebody is there for the other person. We want relationships at a superficial level. But community is built when people get into life, when people get into the muck and the mire of the dailiness of existence with others. And the preacher, he sees somebody and he has nobody else, and he gives us these illustrations to show we're not meant to live alone. He says, you can't keep warm by yourself. You can't get yourself out of trouble. Oh, you may be able to take on one person, but you can't take on two. You can't get through the problems of life by yourself. He says we are created to live with others. Right? Life is better. Life only works when we go through with other people. You know, I see and I've seen my whole life. It is good. It is important. It is vital to come into the sanctuary to hear the preached word of God. But your Christian life will be deficient if this is it for you. Your Christian life will be deficient if there are not people that you are going through the challenges of life together with. That's why small groups, that's why fellowship is such a vital part of what churches do. Right? The writer of Hebrews says, let us consider how we can stir one another up to good works. The point of coming together is not to just see one another. The point of coming together is to stir one another up to good works. You need me, I need you. We need each other in a community of faith. We cannot do it alone. We cannot do it on just a sermon. We need people to bounce ideas off of. We need people to help us see our flaws. We need people to come and help strengthen our weaknesses. We need people to help us grow. We need people for us to help them grow. We need to seek relationships in life that will enable us to better follow God and know Him. God has never intended the Christian life to be lived in solitude. God has never intended faithfulness to be developed by yourself. Even Jesus came and Jesus got a group of guys. Jesus got a group of people to come. He built those relationships. At every time in our life, we need relationships of people we are pouring into, and we need relationships of people that are pouring into us. If you do not have those, you will be exhausted in life. If you don't have people that you're pouring into, you're going to make life about yourself, and it's always going to be about you. And if you don't have people who are pouring into you, you're never going to grow. We need those relationships in our life of people we refresh and who refresh us. And if we live under the sun, if all we are is dust, all this life is about having my now and making a name for myself, I'm going to be isolated because it's all about me. And I'm not going to have any relationships except for what people can do for me and what I can get from them. But when I live life with that vertical view where I see God is the core of my life, then relationships are not about me. Relationships are about being a blessing to other people. And so he warns us about feeling isolated. But then finally, he warns us about rejection. One of the problems in life is we feel rejection. He uses an illustration here of there's an old king, and he won't listen to any advice, and so he's replaced by a young king. And the young king, he starts with humble beginnings, and he makes it all the way to the palace. He goes from prison to the palace. He is doing everything right. But then it doesn't stay that way. The public opinion polls begin to falter. There's discussion about whether or not he's talking about any specific person, and if so, who. I think he's probably talking about Joseph. Joseph went from the prison all the way up to the palace where he ruled, in essence, in the stead of the king. But how does the book of Exodus open? That the people didn't remember Joseph. No one knew Joseph. And here was a guy who was powerful, and here was a guy who was popular, but then it was all gone. See, when we live lives of loneliness and isolation, what tends to happen is then we try and seek popularity. We try and seek people liking us and accepting us, and so we live for that. But the preacher here, he says it's all striving after wind. It's vain because it's fleeting. Popularity does not last. You can look at movies, you can look at the music charts, you can look at television shows, you look at politicians. Somebody can be on top of the world one moment and then nowhere the next day. And if we're living to be accepted, if we're living to be liked by the people around us, if we're living to be liked by those under the sun, he says it's not going to last. It's vanity. Even kings had problems with this. And for Christians, we must decide if we're going to seek to find favor in the eyes of the world or of God. Because we cannot have both. We cannot strive for both. You cannot seek the popularity of the world and approval from God. You cannot seek both of those things. Sometimes God in His grace, as people seek His favor, He gives them favor in the eyes of people around them, but they're not seeking that. I think of a guy like Billy Graham. Billy Graham is a well-respected person universally. But Billy Graham does not live to be accepted by this world. Because he is so focused on being found faithful by God, people admire that. But that's not what his life is about. And if we live to be accepted by this world, if we live so that people around us, that people under the sun think that we're great and that we do great things, he says it's not going to last. We need to care far more about faithfulness than we do popularity. We need to do things that are going to matter for eternity. Let's stop trying to do things that are just going to make us popular here. Let's stop trying to do things that are just going to make us acceptable here. One of the biggest problems I see is when Christians try and gain cultural acceptance. It is never going to happen. Jesus says they hate me, they're going to hate you. And churches compromise truth and they compromise the Word of God in order to try and be accepted by the world around them. And guess what they do? You know what the result is? When they compromise truth to be accepted by the world around them, the world loses esteem for them, and God has nothing to do with them. Instead of finding favor, they find nothing. Another way we might think of this is we need to pick who we would rather be rejected by. Would we rather strive for the world's favor, but be rejected by God for refusing to live for Him? Or would we rather live for God's favor knowing we're going to be rejected by the world around us? The popularity is fading, and that's not what we must live for. God has a different value system than the world has. And if we try and find favor with God by doing His value system, Paul says that the world considers it foolishness. They consider it vanity. Nothing. How is it that God lets this happen? How can a God who controls all things let these difficulties be so prevalent in the world? How can He let injustice and oppression and envy and loneliness and rejection be so pervasive? How can God who controls all things, God who is over all, why doesn't He stop it? Why doesn't he say, okay, injustice is gone, and oppression is gone, and envy is gone, and loneliness is gone? Why doesn't he say that rejection is gone? Why does he still allow this pain and this brokenness and this hurt in the world around us? Well, let us be clear. God did not bring these things into the world. Sin brought these things into the world. We don't get to blame God for the consequences of our actions. That's what we like to do. We like to make bad decisions, and we like to do dumb stuff, and we like to sin and then go, how could God let this happen? But I want us to think for a moment. Because here's what God has done. God did not just say, okay, I'm removing all of these things. God, who exists apart from His creation, God who exists over His creation, entered into His creation. And Jesus came. And Jesus humbled Himself, and Jesus experienced injustice. Oh, we complain about injustice. But Jesus was an innocent man who was crucified by His own creation. Jesus experienced oppression. The oppression of the Romans on the Jews, the oppression of the Pharisees on the people, the oppression of poverty. Jesus didn't have a place to lay His head. Jesus experienced all kinds of oppression. Jesus was met with envy and bitterness and jealousy. Jesus, when He healed people, when Jesus helped people, what was it that the Pharisees said? Did they go, oh, that is wonderful. You made a lame man walk. You got a dead man out of the tomb. They said, we're going to kill him. Jesus was met with loneliness. Think about that. Jesus, who existed from eternity past in this community relationship of the Trinity, for the first time in His life, Jesus was lonely on the cross. Jesus, who had never experienced loneliness, Jesus, who had always had perfect fellowship and community with the Father and the Spirit, as He was on the cross and the wrath of God was poured out on Him, God turned His back on His Son, and Jesus was forsaken by the Father. He was lonely for the first time in eternity. For us. And Jesus experienced rejection by His own creation. He came into His own, and His own knew Him not. He was rejected and despised among men. You see, Jesus came not to remove difficulty, but to help us overcome difficulty. Not to keep us from pain, but to overcome pain for us. Because what Jesus did was not just say, these things aren't going to be a problem to you anymore, I'm removing them. As Jesus entered into them and Jesus experienced them, He was helping us overcome them. Because as Jesus came and Jesus was met with injustice, what did He do? He suffered injustice. Jesus took injustice in Himself, and He accepted our punishment. Jesus overcame injustice by grace. Jesus took the punishment I deserved. Jesus took the wrath that was for me, and He gave me His righteousness. He overcame injustice through grace. He overcomes oppression by comforting the oppressed. Jesus, as He goes around in His ministry on earth, Jesus found those who were oppressed, and He healed them, and He lifted them, and He does the same thing today. He heals the oppressed. He comforts the oppressed. He overcomes our feelings of envy by giving us everything He has and making us of infinite worth. Think about it. I don't have to be envious of anybody because I am a co-heir with Christ. Why should I be envious of a car somebody drives or a house somebody has or a job title somebody has? I am His and He is mine. There is nothing I need. I don't have this need for jealousy and envy because He overcame that for me. He overcomes loneliness by loving us unconditionally and never leaving us. There is no time in my life where I'm ever by myself. And instead of taking the loneliness of this world away. Jesus is with me at all times. Even when I feel lonely, He is there. His presence is there. His comfort is there. His hope is there. There is no sin I can commit that would cause Him to leave me or flee from me. He is always with me. He will never forsake me. And He overcomes the rejection that I feel by being rejected for me, but accepting me in Himself. This world may reject me, and this world may despise me. They may think I'm crazy. They may think I don't know what I'm doing. They may laugh at me. They may point. They may change laws and persecute me. But I am accepted in Jesus Christ. And they can never take that away. And I don't have to live with this fear of rejection, because the God who created me, the God against whom I sinned, He has accepted me in His Son. And when I look around the world and I see God is not fair, I look at Jesus and I say, thank God He's not fair. Because Jesus took all that pain, and Jesus took all that injustice and oppression. Jesus took all of that, and He overcame it through His love and through His grace with His salvation. And my salvation is because God is not fair. And instead of complaining about it, I need to rejoice in it and embrace it and live every day to serve Him and to exalt Him and to tell others who are going through that same brokenness I experience. God is not fair. He's gracious. And that they can know that grace by putting their faith in Jesus Christ. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, Lord, we love You and we thank You for the gift of Your Son. And Lord, I pray that we would be able to see past all our trouble and we can see Your grace. Lord, I pray that we would be able to rejoice in what Christ has done for us. And Father, as we struggle with those things, as we struggle with wondering, are You really in control because of all this pain and all this brokenness we see around us, Father, I pray we would see that Jesus has overcome it. And that part of what it means to follow Him is that You send us into that brokenness to help alleviate the injustice and the oppression and the envy and the loneliness and the rejection. We are Your ambassadors to help fight against that. And Father, I pray for anyone here this morning who is feeling the weight of these difficulties. If there's anyone here this morning, Father, who is feeling the weight of these consequences of living in a sinful world, Father, I pray for Your grace for them. I pray that they would see the comfort that Christ alone offers. And Lord, I pray if there's anyone here who doesn't know Jesus as their Lord and Savior, who's never accepted the freedom that He offers, Father, I pray this morning that they would see life under the sun is just going from dust to dust. But You sent Christ into this world so that our lives have purpose and meaning that last beyond us, Father, that last into eternity. And Father, I pray if there's someone here who doesn't know You, that they'd put their hope and their trust in You. They'd ask You to be Lord of their lives, Father, that they would commit themselves to knowing You and to following You. Father, may we be faithful. May that be what drives us on a daily basis. May every day we live for eternity. And it's in the name of Christ we pray. Amen.